single easiest part.
Mom, have you flipped?
Look, she's better than nothing.
One Friday night in September 1970, a painted school bus rolled onto American television and took the country completely by surprise. 4 years later, it was gone. This is the rise and fall of the Partridge Family. Why it faded so quickly.
They're playing our song.
Please, lady, not in front of my wife. I've never seen it.
The real family behind the fiction. Before there was a Partridge Family, there was the Cowsills, a real family band from Newport, Rhode Island, made up of 6 siblings and their mother Barbara, who had scored genuine pop hits in the late 1960s. They had been on The Ed Sullivan Show, toured nationally, and landed on the charts with songs like The Rain, the Park, and Other Things, and a well-received cover of the musical Hair. Television producer Bob Claver had been looking for a follow-up to The Monkees, which had ended its NBC run in 1968, and saw the Cowsills' blend of family warmth and pop music as the right template for something new. ABC, for its part, was looking for a show to pair with the Brady Bunch on Friday nights and liked the idea of a musical family comedy. The Cowsills were originally approached to star in the series, but the producers ran into a problem. The Cowsill children were not trained actors, and by the time the show was in serious development, their ages no longer matched the characters as written for television. There was also a personal complication. The producers wanted Shirley Jones, who had already been hired, to play the mother. The Cowsills' own mother, Barbara, was central to the real family's identity, and their father, William Cowsill, who served as the family's manager, would not accept a deal that excluded her. The negotiations broke down. The decision was made to hire professional actors and build a fictional version of the concept from the ground up. What the producers left behind, along with the Cowsills, was the real story underneath the concept. William Cowsill was a controlling, often abusive figure whose management of his children's careers caused lasting damage. Several of the Cowsill siblings struggled with addiction in the years that followed. The mother, Barbara, suffered from stage fright that worsened as the family's fame grew. It was not a story suited to a cheerful ABC sitcom. The painted school bus and the idea of a family making music together, those elements stayed. The darker truth behind them was quietly set aside, and the Partridge Family was built in its place.
Look at yesterday. She missed an entire rehearsal.
I think we better do something about it.
How the cast came together. With the fictional premise in place, the producers needed their family. The first and most important casting decision had already been made. Shirley Jones would play the widowed mother, Shirley Partridge, and her involvement was described as non-negotiable from the start. Jones was an Oscar winner, having taken home the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress for her performance in Elmer Gantry in 1960. She was also well known from Oklahoma, Carousel, and The Music Man. Before accepting the role of Shirley Partridge, Jones had turned down a different ABC sitcom launching that same season, The Brady Bunch, which would have had her playing Carol Brady. She later explained that she didn't want to spend her scenes exclusively at home doing domestic work. The Partridge Family offered music, which she loved, and she said yes. The second major casting decision created one of the most unusual real-life dynamics in television history. Jones's own stepson, David Cassidy, the son of her first husband, actor Jack Cassidy, was cast as eldest son Keith Partridge. Cassidy was 20 years old when the show premiered, playing a character written as 17. On screen, they were mother and son. In real life, they were stepmother and stepson, and they had known each other since Cassidy was a child. Jones has said she believed their genuine closeness translated on screen and made the dynamic feel warmer and more natural than it might have with two strangers. For the rest of the family, the studio took a broader approach. When Danny Bonaduce auditioned for the role of wisecracking middle child Danny Partridge, The producers actually filmed a version of the pilot without him to compare. The version with him won. The Hollywood Reporter's review of the pilot singled out Bonaduce as having perhaps the most straightforward acting talent of any of the child stars. He was 10 years old. Susan Dey was cast as teenager Lori. Suzanne Crowe played the youngest daughter, Tracy. Jeremy Gelbwax was cast as Chris, the middle boy, though he would be replaced before season 2 by Brian Forster, after nearly every person on the cast and crew complained about Gelbwax's behavior on set. Dave Madden rounded out the group as Reuben Kincaid, the family's perpetually exasperated manager, who claimed to dislike children but couldn't quite stay away from the Partridges.
Doesn't get finished at all.
We have a doom line, you know.
That's a deadline.
Okay, we'll take the instrumental track this time.
The music was built on a secret. From the very first episode, the Partridge Family performed on screen as a band. All 6 of them, instruments in hand, voices blended in that warm, honeyed sound. None of it was real, and the show never told the audience otherwise. The only 2 cast members who actually sang on the recordings were Shirley Jones and David Cassidy. The other 4 were lip-syncing to tracks they had nothing to do with. The instrumental performances were provided by some of the most accomplished session musicians working in Hollywood at the time, a loose collective of studio veterans who came to be known as the Wrecking Crew, the same group of players who had performed on hit records for artists ranging from the Beach Boys to Frank Sinatra. The backing vocals came from a group of professional studio singers. When young Danny Bonaduce appeared on screen singing the bass harmony, what viewers were actually hearing was a trained adult studio singer. The arrangement was exactly the model Screen Gems had used for the Monkees, and it worked in the same way. Millions of people at home seemed genuinely unconcerned by the mechanics. The first single, I Think I Love You, was written by Tony Romeo and released in August 1970, a full month before the show even premiered. It was a calculated move. Get the song onto radio first, build awareness, and let the show arrive into ears that already knew the music. The producers had the song promoted on teen radio before the show aired in an effort to generate interest in advance. The strategy worked beyond anything they had planned for. The single climbed to number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in November 1970, selling 4 million copies, outselling the Beatles' Let It Be during the same chart period. Shirley Jones, who sang backing vocals on the track, became at that moment the second person in history, after Frank Sinatra, and the first woman to win an Academy Award for acting and also have a number 1 hit on the Billboard Hot 100. The Partridge Family won a NARM Award for Best-Selling Single of the Year in 1970. They were nominated for a Grammy Award for Best New Artist in 1971, losing to the Carpenters. By late 1971, the Partridge Family had 4 albums in the Billboard Top 100 simultaneously. Bell Records reportedly moved 200,000 copies of their records in a single day. 8 studio albums and 2 compilation albums were released under the Partridge Family name between 1970 and 1974. The songwriters contributing to the project included Bobby Hart, who had written for the Monkees, and Mike Appel and Jim Kritikos, who would go on to work closely with a young Bruce Springsteen. For a fictional television band fronted by 1 lead singer and an Oscar-winning actress doing backup, the commercial output was extraordinary.
You know, the funny thing is, I wasn't a phony until I started trying to prove to you I wasn't a phony.
Do you want to try?
David Cassidy and the Making of a Phenomenon. The show's success in the ratings was considerable, but what happened around David Cassidy personally went far beyond anything a television rating can capture. Within months of the show's premiere, he had become the most recognizable young male face in America. By 1972, his fan club had grown to be the largest in history, surpassing those of the Beatles and Elvis Presley. His solo concerts were selling out stadiums worldwide. He played 2 sellout nights of 56,000 fans each at the Houston Astrodome over a single weekend in 1972. His New York Madison Square Garden show sold out in one day and was followed by riots outside afterward. In Australia in 1974, the hysteria was so extreme that there were public calls to have him deported from the country following a 33,000-person concert at Melbourne Cricket Ground. The word Cassidy Mania entered the press and stuck. His concert in the United Kingdom included sellout shows at Wembley Arena in 1973, and he was flown to London by the BBC specifically so they could include footage of him arriving at the airport in the celebration of Top of the Pops' 500th edition. Behind the spectacle, the reality of Cassidy's life was considerably darker. He was filming a television show 5 days a week on a soundstage, then spending weekends performing concerts at an arena scale. He was 21 years old and had, by his own description, almost no private life left. The show kept him locked into a character written as a wholesome teenage boy, while Cassidy was a grown man living through experiences that had nothing in common with Keith Partridge. He was, as he put it later, trapped, required to be publicly cutesy and an eternal virginal teenager when he was becoming a grown man in real life. His face appeared on lunchboxes, coloring books, bubblegum cards, and breakfast cereal boxes. He once asked a housekeeper to buy a specific brand of cereal, and she came back with a giant photo of his own face staring up at him from the packaging. He had no piece of any of the merchandising profits. None of the cast did. The studio was collecting the returns on his image, and he was watching it happen with no recourse. Screen Gems had eventually renegotiated his contract when his manager discovered he had been a minor when he originally signed it, improving his terms. But the licensing of his face and persona remained entirely beyond his control.
Now don't exert yourself. You don't have your strength back yet.
I've got enough strength to wring your neck if you had one.
The Rolling Stone cover that changed everything. In May 1972, while the show was still in production and pulling solid ratings, Cassidy made a decision that would permanently alter the show's trajectory and his own. He agreed to an interview and cover shoot with Rolling Stone magazine. The cover photograph, taken by a then-young Annie Leibovitz, showed Cassidy nearly nude. The headline read, "Naked Lunchbox," a reference to the school supplies that had been bearing his image for the past 2 years. The accompanying article, written by Robin Green, detailed 5 days on the road with Cassidy and described him in terms far removed from the clean-cut character his audience believed in. The resulting fallout, in Cassidy's own word, was seismic. Coca-Cola immediately pulled its sponsorship of a planned Cassidy television special. General Mills moved to withdraw from its partnership. The network's leadership was furious. The broader adult audience Cassidy had hoped to attract never arrived. The move cost him credibility with the bubblegum pop audience that had made him famous, without gaining him the rock audience he was after. Leibovitz later reflected that Cassidy had done something he probably shouldn't have, but also said he had thanked her for it, because the fallout helped push him toward the exit from a contract and a persona that had become suffocating. She described him as having desperately wanted to get off the show and said he had essentially committed professional suicide to escape his own image. The show's ratings remained steady in the short term, but the relationship between Cassidy and the production had changed, and he had made clear to everyone around him that he had no intention of staying.
Sensational?
Sensational?
Well, sure. Look, Mom, we'll see you at home later. Rachel and I have some...
The scheduling decision that sealed the show's fate. In the fall of 1973, heading into season 4, ABC made a programming decision that would directly accelerate the show's end. the network moved The Partridge Family out of its Friday nighttime slot, where it had aired at 8:30 p.m. immediately after The Brady Bunch, and rescheduled it to Saturday nights at 8 p.m. The new competition it faced on Saturday was All in the Family on CBS. At that moment, the most watched series on American television, sitting at the top of the Nielsen ratings. The move stripped the show of the audience it had inherited each week from The Brady Bunch and placed it directly opposite the hardest possible competition. Ratings fell quickly. Within that same season, the producers began adding new characters in an attempt to inject energy. A 4-year-old neighbor child named Ricky Stevens, played by Ricky Siegel, was added at the start of the season to sing children's songs in each episode. He was dropped mid-season. The Kid Next Door, twins, a nephew for Reuben Kincaid. None of the additions changed the direction of the numbers.
Now that star's going up 3 points.
3 whole points.
Lady, why didn't you leave your kid home? I feel like I'm watching.
The White City Tragedy. On May 26, 1974, just 2 months after the show's final episode had aired on ABC, David Cassidy took the stage at White City Stadium in London for what he intended to be the last major concert of his touring career. He had already decided to step away from stadium performances and had made that intention public. The crowd at White City that Sunday evening numbered more than 30,000. As the show began, the audience surged forward toward the stage. In the crush, fans began falling and could not get up. Over 800 people required medical attention that night. Scores were hospitalized, and a 14-year-old girl named Bernadette Whelan was carried out unconscious. She died 4 days later in Hammersmith Hospital. The official cause of death was traumatic asphyxiation. Cassidy was devastated. He said in later years that the White City tragedy had never left him and had been one of the defining events of his life. At the final concert of that tour in Manchester, days after Bernadette Whelan died, the venue was only partially filled. Many parents had refused to let their daughters attend. Cassidy stepped away from touring and from the large-scale public life that had defined the previous 4 years. The tragedy did not cause the show's cancellation. The final episode had already aired, but it bookended the entire era in the most painful way imaginable. The show ended quietly on a scheduling chart. The tour ended in grief.
See, I got this job distributing leaflets on the street for a product called Sir Lancelot Plums. They think the night suit will attract attention.
What the cast left behind. By the time the show ended in March 1974, after 96 episodes, the people who had made it were at very different points in their lives. Shirley Jones continued working steadily across film and television, her career well established long before the Partridges and continuing long after. In 1977, 3 years after the show ended, she and other cast members gathered with the cast of My Three Sons for an ABC special called Thanksgiving Reunion with the Partridge Family and My Three Sons. She has remained the most consistently active member of the original cast across the decades since, appearing in everything from features to television movies to guest roles well into her 80s. Susan Dey went on to a successful dramatic career that in many ways overshadowed what she had done on The Partridge Family. Her most prominent post-Partridge work came as Assistant District Attorney Grace Van Owen on L.A. Law, the Stephen Bachko legal drama that ran on NBC from 1986 to 1994. She earned both Emmy and Golden Globe nominations for that role, a sharp contrast to her work as a teenager in matching velvet pantsuits on a Saturday morning bus. Dey has given very few interviews about the Partridge Family years and has largely declined to participate in reunion activities, with a brief phone call to Danny Bonadus's 1995 talk show among the rare exceptions. Dave Madden, who played the long-suffering Reuben Kincaid, worked steadily in character parts for decades after the show ended and died in January 2014. Danny Bonaduce's experience after the show was harder and more public. He had been a child performer who aged out of the specific kind of appeal that made him famous, and the years that followed were marked by well-documented struggles, substance abuse, an arrest for attempting to buy cocaine in Daytona Beach in 1990, and legal difficulties that played out in the tabloid press. He reinvented himself as a radio personality and spent much of the 1990s as a disc jockey, eventually returning to television in the reality format. He has spoken about those years with more candor than most people in his position would. Brian Forster, who stepped into the role of Chris Partridge for 3 seasons after Jeremy Gelbwaks was let go, largely walked away from acting when the show ended and pursued an entirely different life as a professional race car driver. Suzanne Crowe, who had played Little Tracy from the very beginning, also moved away from entertainment, built a quiet, private life, and died in April 2015 at the age of 52, the first member of the original cast to pass away.
What are you doing?
Can you make out what she's saying?
No, but I bet they're not exchanging recipes.
You're all
Why it faded so quickly. Looking back from a distance of 50 years, the speed of the show's decline makes more sense than it might have seemed at the time. The Partridge Family was built on a very specific set of conditions, and when any one of them changed, the whole structure shifted. The show needed its Friday night position behind the Brady Bunch. Remove that lead-in, and the audience numbers dropped immediately. It needed David Cassidy willing to occupy the Keith Partridge persona without visible resistance. Once he began pushing against it publicly, the show's internal momentum stalled. And it needed the bubblegum pop era's particular cultural moment, which was already giving way to harder rock and heavier sounds by 1972 and 1973. All in the Family and MASH were changing what audiences expected from television. A family pop band in matching outfits was a very specific answer to a question the culture was no longer asking in the same way. Cassidy had also never planned to stay. Shirley Jones confirmed this in later interviews, saying plainly that David had had enough and wanted to move on to a different kind of music, and that the combination of his departure and the scheduling problems made cancellation the clear conclusion. He had not resigned. Without him, the show had no center. A BC pulled the plug, and the bus was parked for good.
Name ring a bell? Danny! Oh, Keith. Oh, Keith. Keith, speak to me.
The legacy. For a show that ended after just 4 seasons, the Partridge Family left a surprisingly durable impression on American pop culture. The phrase, "Come on, get happy," entered the language. The image of the hand-painted school bus, a 1955 Chevrolet painted in orange, yellow, and red, became immediately recognizable to anyone who lived through the early 1970s. David Cassidy's solo career continued well into the decades that followed, particularly in the United Kingdom, where he remained a significant draw long after American audiences had moved on. He became the first recording artist to release a hit version of I Write the Songs, a song later made famous as Barry Manilow's signature tune, when his recording peaked at number 11 on the British charts in 1975. The animated Saturday morning spin-off, The Partridge Family, 2020 AD aired briefly in 1974 and 1975, sending the family into outer space to perform concerts. It ran for 16 episodes before being canceled. Shirley Jones and David Cassidy did not provide their voices for the animated version. The show continued in syndication reruns through much of the decade and found new audiences through cable, eventually landing on Nick at Night in 1993. In 1999, ABC aired a behind-the-scenes television movie called Come On Get Happy, the Partridge Family story, dramatizing the production years and their toll on the cast. In 2004, VH1 developed a pilot for a revived version of the series. Among its cast was a 16-year-old actress in her first ever screen role, Emma Stone, playing Laurie Partridge. The pilot was the only episode produced. The project went no further. David Cassidy died on November 21, 2017, at the age of 67, having been diagnosed with dementia the previous year, the same illness that had affected his mother and his grandfather. The diagnosis had forced him to stop touring. He had said publicly that he wanted to focus on what and who he was, without distraction, and that he wanted to love and enjoy life. He spent the final chapter of his life carrying the weight of a fame that had come too fast, too young, and had never entirely let him go. The Partridge Family rose in a burst of color and sound and fell quickly, as most phenomena built around a single personality and a single cultural moment tend to do. What remains is the music, the bus, and the memory of Friday nights when the whole thing felt like it would last forever. It burned bright and it burned fast. And for everyone who was there for those 4 years, it left something that didn't fade the same way the ratings did. If you enjoyed going through all of this, hit that like button and subscribe. There are more of these waiting for you right here. We'll see you in the next one.